The real reason we haven't been back to the moon. We walked on the moon 6 times, brought people home alive, and then just stopped. More than 50 years later, with computers that would make Apollo look like a toaster with anxiety, we still haven't gone back. And the real reason isn't just money. It isn't just politics. It isn't even that we somehow lost the tech. It's stranger than that. The giant machine that made Apollo work fell apart. The moon turned out to be nastier than the brochures. And the kind of risk Apollo accepted would make modern officials break out in hives. So let's go back to the story everybody thinks they know. Most people tell this story like it's simple. America went to the moon, planted the flag, got bored, and moved on. Nice, clean, done. But that version leaves out the parts that actually matter, and honestly, the missing parts are the whole story. So here's the path. First, we go back to the Cold War. Because the moon mission started as geopolitics wearing a spacesuit. Then we watch Apollo collapse almost as fast as it rose. After that, we get into the part people call lost technology, which is real in one sense and totally wrong in another. Then the moon itself shows up like an angry landlord, because lunar dust, radiation, and weird regolith mechanics turn every small task into a stupidly hard one. Then we get to Artemis, China, and why going back now is slower, messier, and in some ways harder than it was in the 1960s. That brings us to the big question. Did we stop because we couldn't go back, or because we stopped wanting to pay the real price? Because the price was never just cash. It was danger, political focus, industrial muscle, and a willingness to accept odds that sound wild now. And the strangest part is this. The moon we're trying to return to isn't really the moon Apollo visited. Same rock, very different mission. So go to 1961, because that's where this starts. The moon was never the point. In 1961, the United States wasn't staring at the moon because people suddenly got poetic about craters. The panic came from Earth. First Sputnik went up in 1957, and that hit Americans like a slap. Then Yuri Gagarin orbited Earth in April 1961, and that landed even harder. If the Soviet Union could launch satellites and people into space first, then maybe Soviet rockets were better. If Soviet rockets were better, then Soviet missiles might be better too. Space was science, sure, but it was also military fear in a shiny helmet. That's the mood John F. Kennedy stepped into when he went before Congress on May 25, 1961, and committed the country to landing a man on the moon and bringing him back safely before the decade ended. Notice what he did there. He picked a deadline before the road existed. He chose a target not because it was easy to explain to engineers, but because it was hard, public, and impossible to fake. The moon became the biggest possible scoreboard, and the country went all in. Not halfway, not let's study options, really all in. During Apollo's peak in the 1960s, NASA consumed about 4% of the federal budget. That number sounds fake now, because today, NASA gets a tiny fraction of that. Back then though, the United States treated the moon like a national emergency with better branding. Hundreds of thousands of people worked directly or through contractors. More than 20,000 companies and universities fed into the program. This wasn't one agency doing neat science experiments. This was a whole industrial nation turning its face in one direction. That scale matters, because Apollo wasn't powered by genius alone. People love the heroic version, the brave astronauts, the control room, the famous speeches. All true. But underneath that was a giant manufacturing beast, chewing through money, metal, chemicals, electronics, and human labor at a pace that only makes sense if the goal feels politically non-negotiable. If the country had treated Apollo like a normal research project, it never gets off the pad. There was another thing Apollo had that's easy to forget now: public tolerance for risk that sounds almost unreal. NASA had already seen how deadly this could get. The Apollo 1 fire in 1967 killed Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee during a ground test. Even after that, the program kept moving, because stopping looked worse than pushing forward. That's not because people were careless. It's because the mission sat inside Cold War logic, where falling behind carried its own kind of terror. And for a while, that logic worked. The moon race gave the United States a simple, brutal advantage. One goal, one rival, one finish line. You can build amazing things under those conditions because almost every argument gets easier. Why spend this much? Because we have to win. Why move this fast? Because the other side is moving. Why accept this danger? Because not acting feels more dangerous. We are better at almost every supporting technology now. Computing, materials, simulation, communications, all of it. But we are much worse at that kind of focus. That's the weird trade. We have stronger tools and weaker alignment. Apollo had weaker tools and absurd alignment, and in this case, alignment mattered more. Then Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface in July 1969, and the mission that had justified everything began to evaporate almost immediately. Why we stopped so fast? Once Apollo 11 landed, the strange part wasn't that America celebrated. Of course it did. The strange part was how fast the mood changed after that. You'd think the first moon landing would open the door to a long run of missions people followed with the same obsession. Instead, later flights started feeling, to a lot of viewers, like reruns with different astronauts. Apollo 12 reached the moon just 4 months later, and the public response already looked flatter. By Apollo 13, the networks didn't even bother carrying a crew TV broadcast live before the accident turned the mission into a rescue story. That tells you a lot. The danger could still grab attention. The exploration couldn't hold it by itself. Part of that was money, obviously, but not in the lazy way people usually mean it. It wasn't just that moon flights cost too much. It was that the country had other bills, other wars, and other fights that felt more immediate. Vietnam was swallowing money and attention. Domestic spending battles were getting louder. Cities were in crisis. Inflation pressure was growing. Congress had already started trimming NASA's budget before Neil Armstrong ever stepped onto the surface. So by the time the United States planted the flag, the budget knife was already out. Apollo won at the exact moment its political protection was fading. Nixon didn't help. He liked the headlines when Apollo succeeded, but he wasn't emotionally attached to expensive lunar missions, and he had no reason to protect them the way Kennedy and Johnson had protected the program's climb. For the White House, the moon had become one more item on a long list of costly federal commitments. Once the race looked settled, cutting back became easy. There was no giant national argument for why Mission 7 mattered like Mission 1 had mattered. So the program started shrinking while it was still proving what it could do. Missions that had been planned never flew. Apollo 18, 19, and 20 were canceled. Saturn V rockets ended up in museums or got used for other purposes. The wild part is that Apollo didn't really get the long scientific run it could have had. The later missions were getting better at geology, better at surface operations, better at using the rover, better at staying longer. The astronauts and scientists were finally learning how to do this well. And right then, the ladder got pulled away. Risk played into that too. And this part matters more than people think. Apollo 1 had already shown how brutally fast spaceflight could kill. Then Apollo 13 reminded everyone that you could do almost everything right and still end up one bad tank away from losing a crew deep in space. After a while, the romance starts leaking out of the danger. What looked bold at the start begins to look reckless when the original reason for doing it has faded. Even NASA leaders worried out loud that if flights kept going, eventually the luck would run out. That's why Apollo ended so abruptly. Not because the moon was fully explored, not because the hardware stopped working, not because somebody discovered a secret wall in space that said no further entry. The program ended because the political reason vanished, and once that happened, every launch looked less like destiny and more like a very expensive gamble. And when the mission stopped, a new problem began. A machine that large doesn't sit quietly in storage waiting for somebody to flip the lights back on. The technology wasn't lost. The ecosystem was. This is where people usually say, okay, But if we already did it, why not just build the same thing again? And that sounds reasonable for about 5 seconds, right up until you look at what Apollo actually was. NASA didn't lose the moon like somebody misplaced their car keys. The plans, reports, footage, and engineering records still exist. The harder truth is that the living system that turned those papers into working machines faded away. The Saturn V is the best example. People talk about it like it was one rocket, one object, one neat piece of hardware. It really wasn't. It was a giant web of parts, people, factories, suppliers, test stands, special metals, weird little manufacturing habits, and teams who knew how to solve problems that never made it neatly onto a page. A blueprint can tell you dimensions. It can't fully capture the 1,000 tiny judgments that happen on a shop floor when something almost fits, almost works, almost survives. That kind of knowledge is slippery. One engineer knows a valve tends to misbehave in cold conditions, so the team checks it a certain way. A machinist knows a part needs to be finished with a touch that isn't obvious from the spec sheet. A technician learns that one procedure only works if 2 earlier steps happened in just the right order. Nobody thinks of those as grand secrets, so sometimes they don't get written down with the care they deserve. They just become part of how the work gets done, until the work stops, and then the people leave. That's the part the lost technology line gets half right. The knowledge didn't vanish in one dramatic moment. It leaked away over years. Engineers retired, contractors shut down, or got absorbed into other companies. Facilities got reused, tooling got scrapped. Supply chains that once existed for one very specific reason stopped existing because no one was ordering those parts anymore. If a company only made some oddball component for a lunar rocket, and the lunar rocket dies, that company doesn't sit around waiting half a century for a comeback tour. Try to picture rebuilding a whole orchestra after you fired the musicians, sold the instruments, knocked down the concert hall, and scattered the sheet music across 5 states. You still know the song existed. That doesn't mean you can perform it next Friday. There's also a trap here that sounds backwards until you sit with it. Modern engineers usually don't want to copy old hardware exactly, even if they could. Some Apollo-era materials aren't used the same way now. Some electronics are obsolete. Manufacturing rules changed. Software standards changed. Crew safety standards changed a lot. So the job becomes this weird hybrids. Not rebuilding Apollo, not fully starting fresh, but creating new systems that can do similar things while obeying a completely different set of technical and political rules. That slows everything down. A lot of the old Apollo work happened in a world that tolerated speed, shortcuts in documentation, and levels of personal judgment that would trigger audits today. Modern aerospace has reviews on top of reviews, because if a human spacecraft fails now, the fallout is massive. That means even smart updates come with paperwork, testing, certification, legal pressure, budget fights, and endless redesign loops. You don't just revive an old machine. You drag it through the modern world, and the modern world asks for receipts. That's why we had less computing power back then doesn't settle anything. Sure, we've got better computers now. No joke, your phone could clown Apollo guidance software like a smug calculator with Wi-Fi. But better chips don't magically replace a dead industrial base. They don't bring back dormant suppliers, retired machinists, vanished test stands, or the little shop floor fixes people carried in their heads and never fully wrote down. They don't recreate the rhythm of a nation that spent years building one thing over and over until thousands of people knew it in their bones. So the technology wasn't lost like a file getting deleted. It was abandoned like a town built for one rush, then left to weather. The maps remained. The roads cracked. The people moved on. And even if we somehow rebuilt that whole machine tomorrow, there'd still be one problem waiting for us up there. The moon itself doesn't care how nostalgic we feel. The moon is a hostile little nightmare. So let's talk about the part that gets weird fast. Even if you solve the politics, even if you rebuild the hardware, Even if the money shows up on time, the moon is still sitting there like a trap designed by a committee of sadists. It looks calm from Earth. It isn't calm. It's a place where basic human needs stop being basic and turn into engineering problems with teeth. Start with the dust, because the dust is awful. Lunar dust isn't like beach sand, and it isn't like dirt from your backyard. Down here, wind and water roll grains around and wear off the sharp edges. The moon has neither, so lunar dust stays jagged. Tiny, hard, nasty fragments. More like ground glass and rock splinters than soft powder. Apollo crews kept bringing it into the cabin on their suits, and once it got inside, it irritated eyes and throats, clogged things up, and spread everywhere. Astronaut Harrison Schmitt even reported symptoms people later nicknamed lunar hay fever, which sounds funny until you remember he was sneezing because he'd breathed in material from another world. Scientists still argue about how toxic lunar dust would be over long exposure, but the short version is simple. It's abrasive, chemically reactive, easy to inhale, and bad news for lungs and equipment. And the dust doesn't just sit there politely. It clings. Lunar regolith can get electrostatically charged by sunlight and the space environment. So the stuff sticks to suits, boots, tools, seals, visors, cables, and pretty much anything with the bad luck to exist nearby. Apollo astronauts described brushing it off and then finding it still hanging on. Imagine glitter if glitter hated you and could grind through equipment. That's lunar dust. You think you've cleaned it, then hours later it's still turning every hinge into a tiny argument. This matters because machines hate abrasion, seals hate it, joints hate it, optics hate it, suit layers definitely hate it. During Apollo, the dust wore on suit fabrics, scratched surfaces, and got tracked into the lunar module, where it became a contamination problem inside the one place that was supposed to stay clean. For short missions, crews pushed through it. For longer missions, that same dust turns into a much bigger enemy. A few days of annoyance is one thing. Weeks or months of exposure is a different game. The ground itself is weird too. Regolith looks loose, but it doesn't behave in one simple way. In some spots, it supports weight better than you'd expect. In others, it slips, collapses, sprays, and gets kicked up by engines in ugly ways. Astronauts had trouble with footing. Rovers had to deal with rough terrain and powdery surfaces. Landing engines can blast this stuff outward at high speed, which means every touchdown risks sandblasting the area around it. If you want repeat landings, surface habitats, parked vehicles, solar panels, and working instruments, you need to control that mess. Apollo didn't have to solve that for a permanent outpost. Artemis eventually does. Then stack the rest on top. There's no air, so there's no pressure and no help slowing you down on landing. Every descent is rocket-powered the whole way, which is like trying to lower yourself onto a roof with a flamethrower under your feet. Temperatures swing brutally between sunlight and shadow. Radiation comes in harder because the moon has no thick atmosphere and no global magnetic shield like Earth. So crews have to worry about constant space radiation and the occasional solar storm trying to ruin everybody's week at once. If something breaks, there's no roadside assistance, no quick rescue, no hospital over the horizon. Your day's from home, and every hour depends on hardware continuing to behave in a place that seems built to punish hardware. That's why the moon isn't just far away. Far away is a road trip. The moon is a place where air, water, heat control, power, shelter, fuel, and dust protection all have to be carried, generated, or built while wearing a pressurized suit that already hates your knees. Every ordinary act gets turned into a checklist. Walking is harder. Working is slower. Fixing one broken part can threaten 10 other systems. And this is the piece people miss when they say, "We already did this." Yes, briefly. But the moon didn't become friendly in the meantime. If anything, the closer we looked, the more it turned into one of those deals where the fine print keeps getting worse. That becomes a huge problem once you add modern safety expectations. Because now you're not just trying to survive the moon, You're trying to survive it by rules that no longer shrug at disaster. Why it's harder now than in the 1960s? That brings us to the part that sounds wrong until you really sit with it. In one very real sense, going back now is harder than it was during Apollo, not because physics changed, and not because engineers got worse, but because the mission changed. Our tolerance for danger changed with it. And now every delay has to answer a crowd that expects miracles with zero funerals. Apollo crews flew inside a culture that accepted risk at a level modern programs just won't. After Apollo 1, NASA fixed what it could and kept moving. After Apollo 13, the mission turned into a legend partly because everybody knew how close it came to ending in funerals. The basic deal in those years was blunt. If the country wanted to win, astronauts would fly on machines that still carried serious unknowns. No one loved that. They accepted it. That bargain is gone. Challenger and Columbia burned it out of the system. Since then, American human spaceflight has operated under a much stricter idea of what counts as acceptable danger. If a crew dies now, it doesn't get absorbed as the rough cost of exploration. It triggers investigations, redesigns, delays, public anger, and years of political damage. So modern spacecraft need more backup systems, more testing, more documentation, cleaner escape options, safer re-entry margins, and much stronger proof that the hardware will behave. That is good. It also takes forever. And Artemis isn't trying to repeat Apollo anyway. That's another thing that gets lost in the comparison. Apollo was built for short visits in places chosen partly because they made the missions manageable. Artemis aims at the lunar South Pole, and that changes the whole game. NASA wants to work in an area where sunlight comes in at low angles. Shadows can hide hazards, temperatures in dark craters plunge to extremes, and landing zones get trickier because the terrain is rougher and the lighting is weirder. Great place to hunt for water ice. Terrible place to pretend this is just Apollo with newer laptops. The South Pole matters because that's where future missions may find resources worth using, especially water ice in permanently shadowed regions. Water can support crews, and split apart, it can also provide oxygen and rocket fuel. So the goal now isn't just touch down, grab rocks, leave. The goal is to learn how to operate in a place that might support longer stays and maybe future missions beyond the moon. Useful goal. Harder goal. That one change spreads through everything. Landers need more precision. Surface systems need to survive longer. Suits need to handle tougher conditions and wider crew needs. Mission planners have to think about infrastructure, repeat visits, and how one landing affects the next one. Apollo could treat the moon like a destination. Artemis has to treat it more like a work site, and work sites are fussy, especially when the floor can freeze you, slice your seals, and ruin your day from 6 different directions. So the trap is this. Some people compare Apollo and Artemis like they're the same assignment separated by better electronics. They're not. Apollo was a sprint built to prove a nation could do something first. Artemis is an attempt to build a system that can keep functioning after the headlines fade. Sustainable missions are slower because they're supposed to survive contact with reality. They need supply plans, maintenance plans, crew safety margins, and political support that lasts longer than one dramatic launch. That's why the old line, "We already did this," isn't very helpful. We did a different version of this under looser rules, with a narrower target, for a shorter time, and for a reason strong enough to bulldoze almost every objection. Now the target is harder, the mission is broader, and the rules are tighter. So if the moon is still brutal, and the Apollo machine is long gone, the obvious question is whether the systems we're building now can finally close that gap. Artemis, China, and the return that keeps slipping. After Apollo, NASA didn't just sit in a chair and stare at the wall. It shifted. The space shuttle became the big idea, and the pitch was that reusable spacecraft would make access to space routine. Instead of pushing outward, though, the program kept astronauts close to Earth. That led into the International Space Station, which did real science and taught crews how to live in orbit longer, But it also locked human spaceflight into low Earth orbit for decades. Then came Constellation under George W. Bush, a plan to return to the moon with new rockets and Orion. It started, burned money, fell behind, and got cancelled in 2010. After that, the pieces got rearranged again, and Artemis became the current version of the promise. Artemis is real. That matters. Hardware exists. SLS flew once without crew. Orion went around the moon and came back. The program is not fake. And it's not just one more speech with glossy concept art. But it's also dragging a lot of weight. Timelines keep sliding. Costs stay high. The Orion heat shield raised questions after Artemis first. New lunar suits have taken longer than expected. The landers aren't simple either, because NASA isn't using one neat in-house vehicle like Apollo did. It's leaning on commercial partners. And commercial partners move fast in some ways, slow in others, and they definitely bring their own chaos to the party. That leaves Artemis in an awkward spot. SLS and Orion work as symbols of national commitment, but they're expensive and slow to turn around. Commercial systems look cheaper on paper and potentially much more flexible, but they still need to prove they can do the hard parts reliably. Orbital refueling, lunar landing, surface operations, crew safety, all of that has to work together, not just separately. So the return plan isn't one machine. It's a stack of moving parts held together by contracts, politics, deadlines, and crossed fingers. Meanwhile, something else changed the mood. China stopped being a background detail and started looking like the one thing that might push the United States to stay serious. This isn't the old Soviet story copied line for line. China is not triggering the same kind of public panic that followed Sputnik and Gagarin. But it is creating pressure. China's robotic lunar missions have gone well, and its crewed lunar plans are clear enough to get Washington's attention. Once another country looks like it might build steady momentum toward the moon, the question changes from why bother to are we really okay letting somebody else set the pace? That shift matters, because American moon plans usually die the same boring death. A president announces a bold goal. NASA starts shaping the machinery. Congress funds some of it, not all of it. Schedules slip. Another administration comes in and changes the destination, the architecture, or the message. Deep space programs don't survive on vibes. They need boring consistency, year after year, through arguments, setbacks, and bad headlines. Apollo had that long enough to finish the sprint. Almost everything after it lost that protection halfway through the job. So when people ask whether we can go back, the honest answer isn't mysterious at all. If a country wants the moon badly enough, it funds the work, protects the plan, and keeps going when the process gets ugly and expensive. The United States has said it wants that for years. China may be the reason we find out whether saying it and meaning it are finally the same thing. And that leaves one answer sitting in plain view. Less dramatic than any conspiracy, and a lot more revealing. So the real reason we haven't been back to the moon isn't one neat answer you can slap on a thumbnail and call it a day. Apollo happened inside a rare moment when money, fear, politics, industry, and public attention all locked onto one target at once. Then that moment ended. The rockets stopped flying. The people who knew how to build them moved on. And the country switched from whatever it takes to maybe later. That's the first part, and honestly, it's the part people hate, because it means this wasn't a mystery. It was a choice. The second part is meaner. The moon never turned into a safe, familiar place just because 12 people visited it. It stayed sharp, toxic, abrasive, airless, exposed, and absurdly unforgiving. We learned more, and a lot of what we learned made the job look less romantic and more like a long chain of failure points waiting to happen. That doesn't mean the moon beat us. It means the bill came due, and for a long time nobody wanted to pay it. Then there's the part that annoys people most. We didn't lose some magic spell. We let a giant national capability decay and then acted surprised when it wouldn't start on command. That's different. Much more human, honestly. If you stop training teams, close lines, scatter suppliers, and spend decades doing other things, you don't pick up where you left off. You begin again, except now the rules are tighter, the mission is bigger, and every delay becomes political food. And that's the irony at the center of all this. We know more than Apollo did. We can model more, test more, predict more, and design safer systems. But that extra knowledge doesn't always make the road shorter. Sometimes it does the opposite, because now we're trying to build something that lasts, not just something that wins once on television. That's slower. It's messier. It's less heroic in the movie version. In real life, though, it may be the only version that matters. So no, the reason we haven't been back isn't that NASA forgot where the moon is. It's that Apollo was a crash effort, not a permanent bridge. And building a real bridge turns out to be harder than planting a flag and calling the job done. Now we're about to find out whether this gap was a pause or a habit. Artemis is moving, even with all the delays. China is moving too. The next few years will tell us whether the United States still knows how to stick with a hard goal after the applause dies. If you want more stories where the real answer is stranger, rougher, and way more human than the myth, subscribe and watch the next one.